Reddit, what's the most unbelievable small world coincidence you've ever experienced? Lost my wallet while backpacking across Europe, specifically in a small German town. Heartbreaking, full of mementos. A year later, back home in Seattle, my new roommate was unpacking. He pulled out this old, beat-up leather wallet and said, "Crazy story, found this in a random alley in Germany. The student ID belongs to some American girl, but I never saw her." He tossed it to me. It was my wallet. The same little scratches, the torn corner. My face was on the ID. My mind exploded. I was on a solo trip in Tokyo, exploring a tiny, obscure ramen shop recommended by a local. The place was packed, and I ended up sharing a table with another solo traveler. We started chatting, swapping travel stories. He mentioned growing up in a specific, tiny rural town in Montana. My jaw dropped. It was the same town my estranged grandmother had moved to years ago. Turns out, he was her neighbor and knew exactly who she was. In a city of millions at a random ramen spot. My best friend from college was visiting, and I introduced her to my current coworker, who also happened to be a close friend. They started talking and somehow landed on childhood summer camps. Turns out, they were bunkmates at the exact same obscure arts camp 15 years ago for 3 consecutive summers. They even remembered the same silly inside jokes and camp counselor. I just sat there, watching 2 completely separate parts of my life realize they'd already intersected in the most random way imaginable. Years ago, I drew a super specific, bizarre doodle on a bar napkin after a bad breakup. A sad pug wearing a tiny sombrero and crying a single tear. I left it there. Fast forward 5 years, I'm at a tattoo shop getting some new ink, and the artist asks if I want to see some cool flash art his previous client drew for fun. He pulls out a laminated sheet. There it was. My sad pug in a sombrero. He explained the client worked at the bar where I left it and saved it because it made him laugh. Now it's my tattoo. My partner and I were looking at houses, and we found this charming place with a great backyard. During the viewing, the real estate agent mentioned the previous owner had passed away recently. We were about to leave when I saw an old, framed photograph on a shelf. A sepia-toned picture of a young couple from the 1940s. My partner gasped. It was his grandparents. They had owned this house for decades before we were even born, and we stumbled upon it completely by chance. Blew our minds. I moved halfway across the country for a new job. First day, during introductions, I started chatting with a colleague. We talked about where we grew up. He mentioned his small hometown and a specific, rather infamous story about the town's pet llama escaping and causing chaos at the annual parade. I froze. I was at that parade. I was the kid who accidentally unlatched the gate. We had been witnesses to the same bizarre event on opposite sides of the country over 20 years ago. I was flying home from conference, and my flight got seriously delayed. Stuck at the gate, I struck up a conversation with the person next to me. We somehow got onto obscure internet forums. I mentioned my niche hobby, collecting rare, vintage sci-fi movie posters, and the tiny forum where I'd found some incredible deals. He looked at me blankly for a second, then his eyes widened. "Dude," he said, "are you Retro Real Fanatic from the Galactic Gems forum? I'm Cinematicrate Kropka. We've been trading PMs for years." My buddy and I decided to go on a completely spontaneous road trip to a national park we'd never visited, a good 12-hour drive away. We pulled into a small, isolated gas station in the middle of nowhere for fuel and snacks. As I walked out, I saw my high school drama teacher, Mr. Harrison, filling up his minivan. He looked at me, blinked, and said, "Well, if it isn't my name, what on earth are you doing here?" Neither of us had been in that state before. The sheer odds felt astronomical. At a random bar in a new city, I got into a deep conversation with a stranger about the absolute weirdest, most obscure thing from my childhood. A bizarre ritual at a niche summer camp for gifted kids. I described the counselors, the weird daily chants, the peculiar mascot. As I finished, the guy's eyes widened. He started recounting the exact same details, down to the mascot's name. We'd been at the exact same camp, the exact same week, over 20 years ago, and had never crossed paths until that moment. I finally pulled the trigger on a vintage acoustic guitar I found online, shipping it halfway across the country. When it arrived, I carefully opened the case and found an old, faded inscription on the inside of the lid. "To the next dreamer, from M. Davison." It instantly clicked. Mrs. Davison was my 4th grade music teacher, who'd introduced me to the guitar. I tracked her down. She'd sold it years ago, never imagining it would find its way back to someone she taught. Truly wild. For nearly 5 years, I played an online MMO religiously with a fantastic guild, especially close with one guy, Netrunner, who lived across the ocean. We planned to meet at a huge gaming convention. We finally connected, laughing about our long-distance friendship. He mentioned he grew up in a tiny, obscure town, and I blurted out, "Wait, that's where my grandma lives." Turns out, he lived 3 blocks from her house, and we'd even frequented the same local arcade as kids, never knowing. A clumsy fall landed me in the ER with a twisted ankle. The doctor who came in recognized my unusual last name. He hesitantly asked if I'd gone to Pine Ridge Elementary in the late 90s. I said yes. He then got a huge grin, looked me in the eye, and said, "You saved my life when I choked on a grape in kindergarten, didn't you?" I never forgot. 25 years later, he was my emergency physician. Insane how life circles around. I was showing my new colleague old family vacation slides from a trip to Morocco in '98, lots of chaotic market scenes. We paused on one particularly busy photo. He squinted at a blurry figure in the background, laughed, and said, "That guy looks exactly like my dad." I joked back. He zoomed in, pointed to a small scar on a man's hand, and then, stunned, said, "Is my dad. He was on his honeymoon there." Our families, same obscure market, same moment, years ago, captured in one frame. Moving into my first adult apartment, I found a pile of old mail addressed to the previous tenant, Sarah Jenkins, shoved behind a cabinet. I didn't think much of it until I mentioned the name to my best friend, Alex. His jaw dropped. "Sarah Jenkins?" he asked. "That's my older sister. She lived in that exact building, that exact apartment, when she was in college. I had rented my best friend's sibling's old place for 3 years before we realized. Wildest coincidence ever." I'm big into historical reenactment, specifically Roman legions. So I flew halfway across the world for a huge international gathering in Romania. Dressed head to toe in leather and chain mail, I struck up a conversation with another legionary. We talked shop, then swapped stories about where we were from. He mentioned Ashwood Valley. My heart stopped. I'm from Ashwood Valley, a tiny village of 500 people. We'd never met until we were 3,000 miles away, dressed as ancient Romans. What are the odds? At work, I was ranting about this absolutely bizarre low-budget kids show I watched as a child in the early 90s. It only aired in one obscure regional broadcast area for a few months before disappearing. I genuinely thought I was the only person who remembered Captain Comet's space adventure. My new colleague, who just moved here from over 1,000 miles away, stopped typing. He looked at me, deadpan, and started humming the theme song. We grew up on opposite sides of our state, but both in that incredibly specific broadcast zone. My cousin's wedding last summer was great, but the real mind-bender happened at our table. Her mom had laid out a bunch of old family photos as decoration. I was chatting with a guy I just met, Mark, when he pointed at one, a blurry picture of my cousin from her freshman year dorm. "Hey, that's hilarious," he said. "Look, in the background, walking past her open door. That's definitely you, isn't it?" I squinted, and it was my old college hoodie. Turns out, he was her dorm neighbor and a casual friend, and I'd lived on the floor above her, never met him until that day, 10 years later. We adopted a rescue dog, a goofy terrier mix named Rufus, about 6 months ago. Absolutely adore him. Took him to the vet for his annual checkup last week, and the vet tech walking him back after his shots just froze, staring. "Rufus?" she whispered, looking shocked. Turns out, she was his foster mom for the 6 months before he ended up at the shelter. She literally started tearing up, saying he was her favorite, and she cried when he left. Oh, and she lives 2 streets over from me. We trade dog sitting now. Swiped right on this amazing guy, Ben, on a dating app. We clicked instantly, bonding over our surprisingly obscure shared passion for obscure 80s synth pop. A few dates in, we started realizing we both had a mutual friend named Dave from college. Not just any Dave, the Dave, my college roommate's older brother. It wasn't until Ben showed me a photo from Dave's wedding 2 years ago that my jaw dropped. I was in the background on the dance floor. We were literally at the same wedding, in the same room, celebrating the same mutual friend, and never spoke. I was backpacking through a really remote part of Vietnam, tiny village, no other Westerners around for miles. Ended up at this minuscule guest house that only had 3 rooms. I was settling into mine when I heard this incredibly distinctive, booming laugh from the room next door. You know, the kind you'd recognize anywhere. My stomach dropped. It was Mr. Harrison, my incredibly strict, perpetually grumpy high school history teacher. He looked just as horrified to see me there. We ended up sharing a completely awkward, yet unforgettable, dinner. I lost my expensive camera bag at a park bench one afternoon. Total panic. Retraced my steps for an hour. Nothing. Then my phone rang. A woman had found it. When I met her to pick it up, we started chatting. She mentioned she'd recognized my old, beat-up elementary school keychain hanging off one of the zippers. We realized we'd gone to the same tiny elementary school. We're in the same first-grade class together. She lived 2 blocks from me all that time, and we hadn't seen each other since. She still remembered my favorite color from first grade. During college, I worked at this super tiny independent coffee shop. One slow Tuesday morning, a well-dressed woman ordered a caramel latte. Her voice was just incredibly familiar, like a ghost from my past. As I handed her the drink, she paused, squinted at my name tag, and then her eyes widened. "Oh my goodness," she exclaimed. "You're Emily Henderson? I was your kindergarten teacher." Turns out, Mrs. Davies was visiting her sister in town and just stopped in for coffee. She hadn't seen me in 18 years, but remembered my last name. Wild. I signed up for a beginner's pottery class on a whim, needing a creative outlet. First day, I was completely failing at centering the clay, and the woman next to me was doing equally terribly. We laughed about it, then introduced ourselves. "Hi, I'm Sarah," she said. "No way, I'm Sarah too," I replied. We joked about the odds, then she asked where I grew up. Same town, same street. Our childhood homes literally backed onto each other. We had shared a fence for years as kids, just never met face to face until 25 years later, over a spinning lump of clay. My garage door spring snapped last month. Super inconvenient. Called the first local repair service I found online. A young guy, probably early 20s, showed up to fix it. We got to chatting while he worked. He mentioned his dad owned the company and had just retired, leaving him in charge. I asked his dad's name, just out of curiosity. "Mr. Thompson," he said. My stomach did a flip. Mr. Thompson was my middle school shop teacher, who hadn't even recognized me, but when I mentioned the class, he remembered my project immediately. Small world indeed. Years ago, I lost my wallet while visiting a theme park a few states over. Figured it was gone for good. A week later, a package arrived with my wallet, everything intact. The note inside simply said, "Found by name, a friend of your dad's." Turns out, the guy who found it was not only from my tiny hometown, but was a former student of my dad's from high school, 30 years ago. He recognized my last name, remembered my dad, and went out of his way to mail it back. Smallest world ever. My partner and I were on our honeymoon in Iceland, standing on the black sand beach, miles from anywhere. We struck up a conversation with another couple from the U.S. As we chatted, it came out that the husband had gone to a very specific small liberal arts college. Turns out, he was roommates with a guy I dated briefly in freshman year. We'd both ended up in Iceland that same week, completely unaware. The universe just loves a good, awkward reunion. During lockdown, I got really into this obscure online RPG. I found a great guild and particularly bonded with one player, Toxic Gamer 69, who was super competitive but funny. We ended up voice chatting a lot. One day, he mentioned his hometown and a really specific niche local landmark. My jaw dropped. Turns out Toxic Gamer 69 was my third grade bully, Chad. We've actually been decent online friends for months now, totally unknowingly. Still kind of messes with my head. First day of my new job, HR handed me my access card, and I noticed my coworker's desk nameplate had my extremely rare surname. We both looked at each other, confused. There are only a handful of us with this last name globally. We started talking and quickly realized our great-grandparents were not only from the same tiny village in rural Italy, but were next-door neighbors before emigrating. We were both working in the same office, thousands of miles from our shared ancestral home. Unbelievable. I had an old, beaten-up wooden desk from a flea market with unique carvings on the side. I loved it, but it was time for an upgrade, so I put it up for sale online. A guy came to pick it up, and while we were loading it, he ran his hand over the carvings. He paused, tracing one particular etching. He looked at me, then back at the desk, his jaw dropping. "This was my great-grandfather's," he said. "It went missing from our family in the 70s. I bought it for $50. The universe works in mysterious ways." On a solo trip to rural Vietnam, I ended up at a tiny guest house run by an elderly woman. We were chatting over dinner, and she asked where I was from. I told her my small city in Canada. She immediately perked up and said, "Oh, my daughter lived there for a few years in the 90s. We continued talking, and it turned out her daughter, my guest house owner's child, had lived on the very same street as my childhood home. Her sister even babysat me briefly when I was like 5. Thousands of miles from home, and my guest house owner was practically family. The world is truly something else.